Greetings to all the students who have joined us this morning. Good morning to the teachers, the organizers, the technical team, all the parents, educators, and all who have tuned in this morning to this sixth lecture in the school's history lecture series. My name is Vereen Shepherd. Yes, I am author of some of the books you use to study Caribbean history, including Liberties Lost and Freedoms Won. And I'm also director of the Center for Reparation at Research at the University of the West Indies. I will serve as your moderator today. But before I ask Mr. Earl Bousquet to give the official welcome, let me just say how pleased I am that Dr. Turner and Dr. Reed, two of my past students at the University of the West Indies, have taken the time to be with us today. They have become fine historians. And today they will not only provide content that you will need, but they will also help to debunk some of the myths of history, including that on this day in 1807, Britain ended the trafficking of Africans to the Caribbean. Yes, Britain may have passed an abolition act on March 25, 1807, but ships flying the British flag traded Africans to the Caribbean down to 1811 and perhaps even beyond. The freedom that enslaved people sought did not become a reality until over 3 decades later in the case of the British colonized Caribbean. More, in the case of other colonized parts of the Caribbean under the stronghold of France, Portugal, the Netherlands, and Spain. Of course, Haiti had seized its freedom and got its independence as early as 1804. So learn history so that you can become informed and also develop a more liberating narrative of self and a more accurate account of the region's history. And so now it is my pleasure to ask Mr. Earl Bousquet, collaborator on this lecture series, along with the committee, the National Committee on Reparation in St. Lucia. And he's chair of the St. Lucia National Reparation Committee, in fact, and member of the CARICOM Reparation Commission. And he's a renowned journalist. So I give him the floor now so he can give his official welcome to you.
Good morning and thank you, Professor Shepherd, and welcome to everyone to our 6th annual Caribbean Schools History Lecture, which takes us to the halfway mark in our year-long series. Welcome to all of you tuned in from wherever, at home or in class under lockdown, or simply working from home in accordance with safety protocols in St. Lucia, the Caribbean, and the world. Madam Chair will fully introduce our 2 esteemed presenters, who I'm sure will put today's date, March 25th, the International Day for Remembrance of Victims of Slavery and the Transatlantic Slave Trade, in new and different perspectives. So, as we are overly fond of saying here in St. Lucia, protocols having been established, in this case, both COVID and diplomatic protocols, I will address the rest of my remarks directly to the students. To students, teachers, and principals together and in that order. Because these lectures focus, as we have always pointed out, on history subjects ranging from slavery, emancipation, and abolition to resistance, revolution, and of course, reparations. A central theme since last year's first lecture by Professor Shepherd, however, has been continued revelation of the unvarnished truths about Caribbean history that either have never been taught in schools or were written with intent to forever mislead and miseducate Caribbean people, starting with students. They stuffed our colonial history books with stories created in their own images and likeness, like the Royal Crown Readers, renamed the West Indian Readers, with texts like New Worlds to Conquer, that made our history look like it started in 1492, when Christopher Columbus had actually lost his way and ended up in the Caribbean and misnamed it the West Indies because he actually thought he was in India. With the support of CARICOM governments, the University of the West Indies, Caribbean historians, sociologists, and educators from the region and beyond, we have ensured that the subjects are in keeping with guidelines for CAPE, CSEC, and CXC modules. We know history is not your favorite subject, at least most of you, but most of us, the organizers, have lived long enough to learn the lessons and the costs of not knowing our true history and having to learn it all over. We learned long ago sayings like, a people without knowledge of their history is like a tree without its roots. And you cannot decide where you're going if you don't know where you came from. You, the 21st century generation, Generation Next, tomorrow's people, tomorrow's leaders, you have a duty to yourselves and to the generations you will give birth to, as you will, to know your true history and not only what's written in your textbooks. You have the best opportunities Caribbean students have ever had in our entire history of learning our true history. Why? Because it's all written, at least most of it, and it's all out there at your fingertips. But the likes of me had to sit at the Central Library or borrow a book, as there was always only one copy. These true history teasers that we give you for 2 hours every month, yes, it's only 2 hours out of 720 per month, can serve for years and forever if made proper use of. We know the information isn't boring, but we are not getting enough feedback from you as to how you feel about it. Just like in class at school, we want to hear from you, the students in particular, but in this specific case, where what we are teaching might also be new to many teachers and principals, we also want to hear from them about how best to get students more involved. We have your attention, but we need more interaction, more interactivity. Like you, we were also not taught the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth about our history. Why? Because, as we know, history is always written by the conqueror. History, however, is not seen, unfortunately, is not seen as important to to those among you who only attend school to pass exams and earn certificates to enhance job prospects on that supposedly open, free, virtual, global market or highway that has always remained largely closed to people of color, whether black or brown or in between. The brain drain was designed with you and all of us in mind, with subjects specifically selected and offered to prepare you and us to seek a bright future, not enlightening the darkness Europe left in the Caribbean after centuries of slavery and colonialism, but to add brighter lights to attract and dazzle even more of us, every one of you included. Nothing wrong with wanting to be a scientist or an internet venture capitalist or the next inventor of something that will put your name in history. But how many of you, how many of us can be the next Jeff Bezos or Elon Musk or Bill Gates or Jack Ma or the first Caribbean billionaire woman, for example? And how easy will it be to get in the front of the line as immigrants pursuing dreams in proverbial lands of milk and honey, where the milk has long virtually turned sour for most, and the honey has definitely lost its sweetness? Nothing wrong with wanting to do all these admirable things, but you can also make a name for yourself in Caribbean and world history by thinking and initiating ideas and plans to solve the perennial problems that have continued to face us for life. For example, like simply finding a formula to ensure we grow what we eat and eat what we grow to eliminate our food import bill and better feed all of our people. Or finding ways to marry our sun, wind, and waves with our rain, rivers, and freshwater springs to create new energy and water projects with these infinitely valuable resources that continue to go to waste across our region. If my old mind can be so fertile, you, the younger Caribbean minds, we are sure, can think up and do up all these things and imagine even more to create much more as good and even better, as good as and even better, I repeat, than any student anywhere in America or Europe, China or India or Africa. But essential to all of this is understanding your and our history, not his story. That's our message to you at the very start of today's session. And I hope that having set the stage, you will, as of this lecture, as of this morning, use the links available to communicate with us. Let us know what you think, right or wrong, good or bad. All feedback is welcome because it's always going to be all the better for all of us and eventually for all of our region and our people's future. So let me say I'm sorry for stealing a little more time than you would have expected, but as some lawbreakers also often say here in St. Lucia when caught before the courts virtually with their proverbial pants down, I plead guilty with explanation. Over to you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Bousquet, for your opening speech. I now give the floor to Dr. Sasha Turner. Let me introduce her. Dr. Sasha Turner is an associate professor of history at Johns Hopkins University, who writes widely on topics relating to the social and cultural history of the Caribbean. Dr. Turner did her first degree at the University of the West Indies, and her work has appeared in several academic publications, and her most recent book, Contested Bodies, explores issues of pregnancy, childbearing, and enslavement in Jamaica. Dr. Turner, the floor is yours.
Good morning, and thank you very much, Professor Shepherd and the organizers of this event. Today I'll be speaking to the theme of Women's History Month, Choose to Challenge, and I've titled my remarks today, Choose to Challenge, Black Women's Erasure from History. The World Health Organization declared 2020 International Year of the Nurse and Midwife, commemorating the 200th birthday of Florence Nightingale. Nightingale's pioneering work in founding the first nursing training program in St. Thomas Hospital in London earned her recognition as Mother of Nursing. The celebration of Nightingale is not unique, however. It fits well within Western medical traditions that celebrate the greatness of an individual, most commonly white men. White men who supposedly conquered, transformed, and single-handedly defeated one branch of medicine or another. Erased from these great white men and a few white women narrative of medical history are people of African descent who are pioneering practitioners in their own right and whose body, labor, and knowledge furthered the work of the white men named and celebrated today. That we do not know the names of or celebrate African people who paved the way for modern medicine is a function of how knowledge, historical knowledge, gets produced and subjugated. The history of enslavement and medicine overwhelmingly relies on the records produced by white men and women who denied African peoples humanity and refused to see them as capable of anything but brute labor. Plantation logbooks, journals, wills, and letters are riddled with the racist diatribes and exploitative agenda of slaveholders. In choosing to challenge history, we must attend not only to the erasure of Black people's agency, we must also question the very grounds upon which history is written. Our enslaved ancestors provide us with many examples of how they chose to challenge. They ran away, refused to work, poisoned and declared war on those seeking to claim mastery over them. But in the records kept by slaveholders, they told the story very differently. Enslavers falsified enslaved people's refusal to work as laziness. They criminalized rebellion as a death penalty crime and made up diseases to diagnose the enslaved as mentally ill when they ran away. The story of Sally Bassett, an enslaved woman in Bermuda, is a chilling example of how enslaved women's resistance was criminalized, ignoring the real crime of slavery. Bassett was accused of poisoning several individuals, including her enslavers. She supposedly gained knowledge of poison from the devil. Criminalized as an agent of the devil or a witch, Sally was sentenced and burned at the stake in 1730. And here I have an image of Sally Bassett placed in Hamilton, Bermuda in 2008, honoring the memory and resistance of Bassett. Criminalized and executed as a witch, Bassett's act of resistance is emptied of agentive value. She was not an agent. She was simply a criminal, a witch. In this framing, she was merely an evil person doing the devil's bidding instead of a rational actor choosing to challenge the injustices and criminality of enslavement. That she could have formulated poison only with the supposed assistance of the devil is also telling of how witchcraft accusations conjured by the British against Bassett further denied her creative and intellectual ability. I want to add another layer of complexity to Bassett's narrative by looking at the story of another enslaved woman similarly accused of witchcraft in the Caribbean, but with a very different ending. Paula de Iguales was well known across the 17th century Caribbean, having been enslaved in several cities, beginning in her birthplace, Santo Domingo, Hispaniola. Prosecuted for witchcraft, de Iguales served multiple life sentences across several Caribbean cities, including San Juan, Puerto Rico, Santiago de Cuba, Havana, and Cartagena de Indias. Following accusations in Santiago de Cuba in 1624 that Iguales used herbs to heal and harm, and that she could control the weather, fly, and speak with animals, de Iguales was condemned to transportation in Cartagena. But unlike Sally Bassett, who was burned at the stake, de Iguales would serve her sentence, forcibly working at the hospital of San Sebastian. The sight of de Iguales' imprisonment, a hospital, is very telling of the two-facedness of British witchcraft prosecution in the Caribbean. Long before de Iguales' witchcraft trial, she was on the radar of local officials. Refusing to conform to the social expectations of a woman and a slave, authorities long took notice of her. In addition to her renown as a healer, treating patients suffering multiple ailments across various social and racial divides, de Iguales commanded the attention of many through her dress and deportment. Visiting her patients carried on a little and adorned in textiles reserved for colonial elites, such as silk and satins, silver and gold trimmings and embellishments, de Gaules chose to challenge the manners demanded of female slaves. But even as de Gaules resisted the gendered and racial order, her actions were deemed by the British colonial elites, the Spanish colonial elites, sorry, as more disruptive rather than destructive. As far as colonial authorities were concerned, and in contrast to Sally Bassett, de Gaules had not destroyed the life or taken the life of anyone. Disruptive as her presence was, her medical knowledge could still be exploited. De Gaules therefore served her sentence in a hospital, treating many patients, including whites and members of the ruling class, through her various herbal remedies. The stories of Sally Bassett and Paula de Iguales seemed unusual only because we know these women's names and we know a bit more about the particular circumstances of their lives than most other enslaved people. But to be sure, we have more details surrounding their lives because they became ensnared in the colonial injustice system. An alternative social order, however, existed outside the white colonial orbit. Black healers were renowned and revered within their communities because they provided effective remedies and cures for a wide range of ailments. Using roots originating in Africa, such as black-eyed peas, bene, okra, and yams, Black healers relied on medical knowledge they brought with them during the transatlantic crossing. The okra plant, for example, was an important food source for enslaved Africans, but Black herbalists used its leaves to make poultices. Confronted by foreign diseases and ailments in their new environment, enslaved people also adapted by experimenting with new botanicals and healing methods. Like de Gaules, enslaved healers were called upon to treat not just members of their communities, they were the primary health practitioners on plantations. But despite the vital functions Black practitioners played in curing sick people across racial and social divides, we know very little about them, not even their fictitious names in many cases. The names of Black healers enter the records in tiny bits and pieces, such as Nurse Flora, Old Sarah, or Mammy Rachel. Occasionally, we find more traceable entries like Sylvia King, but far more common in the colonial and slavery records were obscure, untraceable references like an old brown woman. We can only glimpse traces of Black healing traditions because Euro-Americans' imposition of colonialism and slavery dispossessed and subjugated Black medical knowledge. As we've seen in the cases of Bassett and de Gaules, Black practitioners were forced into historical oblivion, erased from history by such legal instruments as witchcraft prosecution that left a more extensive record of supposed Black criminality than healing skills. In places like Jamaica and Saint-Domingue, present-day Haiti, for example, Black approaches to health that combined physical and the spiritual, like Obeah and Voodoo, were criminalized as witchcraft and later as fraud. Let me wrap up my brief remarks with one last example of how our ancestors resisted and how their resistance offers a roadmap of how we can choose to challenge the writing of history. Pictured here is Mary C. Cole, one of the most renowned Black women and Black healers historically. In 2016, a statue in her likeness was unveiled on the grounds of the St. Thomas Hospital, London, to commemorate Seacole's contribution to modern nursing. The memorialization of Mary Seacole was a long and hard-fought battle. Like her enslaved predecessors, Sally Bassett and Paula de Iguales, the old brown woman, Nurse Flora, and many others whose names have been erased from history, Seacole was subjected to unjustifiable scrutiny and imperiled by historical erasure. Scholars and members of the general public protested Seacole's commemorative statue, rejecting her role as a nurse pioneer. Seacole is no Florence Nightingale, many insist, having published nothing more than an autobiography that tells only of her global travels and frivolity and offers very little on nursing, protesters claim. Nightingale herself rejected Seacole as a nurse, presuming her race barred her from possessing requisite skill and knowledge to contribute to Britain's medical needs during the Crimean War. To be clear, Seacole did not see herself merely as a healer, working to institutionalize nursing as Nightingale did. Seacole defined herself in terms that far exceeded the gendered and racial straitjacket with which colonizers sought to constrain her. Unlike the writings of Nightingale that sought to order nursing, Seacole's autobiography is a text of resistance. More importantly, it was a text meant to write herself as a subject into being, to write herself into history. Despite the pivotal role Seacole played as a healer in Kingston, Jamaica, her birthplace, and as army nurse in the Crimea, her contributions to modern nursing would have gone unnoticed by historians if not for her autobiography. Seacole was well aware of the specter of historical erasure. She had witnessed firsthand the invisibility of her mother and first teacher, Mrs. Grant, who remains but a shadow despite her preeminence as a healer in Kingston and a nurse for injured soldiers convalescing at her boarding house. With this awareness, Seacole self-consciously wrote herself into history by writing her autobiography. Seacole's autobiography provides unparalleled testimony of her work as a wartime nurse during the Crimean War. Despite the British office's rejection of Seacole's application to serve as military nurse, Seacole funded her own travel to the Crimea and offered a range of healing services to injured British soldiers. Beyond her international travel in London and the Crimea, Seacole also worked as a healer throughout the Caribbean and Latin America. In addition to providing simple cures for treating everyday illnesses from her home in Kingston, Seacole was on the front line of Jamaica's cholera outbreak in the 1850s. Without her autobiography, Seacole would be but a fleeting shadow in the historical records curated by British colonizers. But Seacole's autobiography did more than challenge the historical record on her accomplishment as a healer. Seacole set the record straight on the dire hardships of colonial Jamaica that emancipated the enslaved into economic destitution. Historians of empire, writing of the end of slavery, have often claimed emancipation as a failure because of Black people's failing. This narrative was most pronounced in how British historians interpreted one of the key markers of the continued resistance of the formerly enslaved, namely the Morant Bay Rebellion. Rejecting the rebellion as freed people's demand for equality and social and economic justice, colonial authorities and historians used it to condemn Black people as idle, lazy, unruly, and ungovernable. Seacole's memoir is a poignant counter-narrative to such diatribes, however. She recorded her ingenuity and resourcefulness traveling the globe searching for opportunities to advance her healing skills and improve the material conditions of her life. Throughout her travels, she experimented with new medicine and new trade goods. Along the way, Seacole also recorded the inventiveness of fellow travelers who were also fleeing the dire post-emancipation conditions of Jamaica to capitalize on new opportunities in places like Panama and California. In sum, through the language and letter of the law and witchcraft, colonial authorities sought to drain political meaning of Black resistance. Enslavers unnamed, renamed, and rendered nameless African peoples, denying their humanity and their place as producers of knowledge and history. Yet these projects were necessarily incomplete because of Black resistance. From day-to-day acts of resistance, like running away and poisoning slaveholders, to more elaborate actions that depended on long-term planning and strategy like war and autobiographical writings, enslaved and free people consistently asserted their humanity and rights to freedom, equality, and dignity. This Women's History Month, let us take the mandate and example set by all these women pioneers and choose to challenge the intricately layered oppression we continue to face. Let us be attentive not just to the visceral and fully self-evident manifestation of impoverishment and material oppression. Let us also tune in and be prepared to challenge the more subtle and less obvious strategies of Black subject denial that manifests in how history is written. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Turner. That was truly inspiring. And you know, as it's Women's History Month, you are correct. We focus and remember and rememory all the women who chose to challenge. Because had these rebel women as our pioneer historian of women's history, Lucille Mathrid-May always says, if they had not stood up, these rebel women, as she calls them, we would perhaps not be here today. And we would not have ensured that freedom was achieved when it did. Freedom would truly have been delayed for a longer time. So thank you very much for highlighting some of these women and explaining to the students that we must ensure that gender is integrated into the history that they learn. It's my pleasure now to introduce our second speaker, Dr. Ahmed Reed. Dr. Ahmed Reed is an associate professor of Caribbean history at Bronx Community College of the City University of New York. He's also former chair and a current member of the United Nations Working Group of Experts on People of African Descent. Dr. Reed specializes in Caribbean social and economic history, particularly on the economic performance of plantation societies. And like Dr. Sandra Gift, who chaired and moderated the last lecture, the fifth lecture, he's a member of the Center for Reparation Research's network of scholars. He's an anti-colonial champion. He's an anti-colonial historian. He regularly writes to the Jamaica Gleaner. He engages in what we call the deconstruction of the language we use to talk about our ancestors. He always joins those of us who are saying, our enslavers were not slaves. They were enslaved. Let us put the blame where the blame belongs. And he always comes on Talking History on Nationwide 90 FM, the history program that I host, to help students to destabilize the narrative, the colonial narrative, narratives about abolition, about emancipation, about compensation. And I recall that in 2007, when those in the UK were patting themselves on the back and talking about how they abolished the transatlantic trafficking and engaging in what we call down here in the Caribbean, Wilberforce mania, he helped me to put together this book, which perhaps they'll show on the screen later, but I'll just show you quickly, called Freedom Delayed, in which we actually try to destabilize this abolition narrative. So even though today the United Nations has declared it the International Day for the remembrance of the victims of slavery and the transatlantic trafficking in enslaved Africans, our term, not theirs, they say slave trade, we're destabilizing that. We know the true history. And so Dr. Reed will help us to unpack some of these myths and to, tell the truth about what this day represents, as well as the history of the trade in enslaved, the trafficking in enslaved Africans. So over to you, Dr. Reed.
Good morning, Professor Shepherd. Thank you. Good morning to my fellow panelists, Dr. Turner, and to Earl and the others. It's indeed a pleasure, and I want to thank you, Professor Shepherd, for the invitation to speak on today's panel. I'm also heartened by the presence of our high school students in Jamaica and across the region. Today, March 25th, is the International Day of Remembrance of the victims of slavery and the trade in enslaved Africans. It is also worthwhile to note that it was on this day, March 25, 1807, that the Act to Outlaw or Abolish the Trade was passed. I couldn't help but to ask why the need to have an International Remembrance Day. And as I reflected on this, I could not help but to think of the quote from the Nobel laureate, Elie Wiesel, that the executioner kills twice, the second time with silence. We live in a society where pro-colonial sentiments are strong. I remembered, as Prof mentioned, in 2007, when we were organizing around the bicentenary of the abolition of the transatlantic trade in enslaved Africans. The many letters to the editors, newspaper articles, private conversations with friends and acquaintances, all expressing doubt about the strength of our reparations claims, all suggesting it's time for us to move on. How could I forget those elected representatives in the St. Elizabeth Parish Council, who in a resolution in March 2006 urged Jamaicans to, and I quote, forget the shame and the shameful episode of slavery. In the words of one councillor, we should celebrate our achievements, but we should not look back at our shame, end quote. Another councillor opined that we need to leave slavery behind and forget it. All I want to know is how to develop this country. In 2007, Lord Tariq Ahmad, the British Minister of State with responsibility for the Caribbean, Commonwealth, and the United Nations, suggested to Jamaicans that it would be, and I quote, better for Jamaicans to look ahead and to minimize its potential through robust trade than peer into history. I think it's not important looking back, end quote. So it begs the question, why do they want us to forget? And this points to the selective use of history, which brings to the surface the politics of memory and memorialization. So the executioner kills twice, the second time with silence. So what I'm going to do today is to talk you through the trade in enslaved Africans. I will show you a couple of slides and to bring all of this into perspective. And the larger point or purpose for me today is so as to humanize the trade and to let you have some example of what the experiences of enslaved people were during this particular time. So let me just talk you through a few slides. Now, the trade in enslaved Africans started the 16th century in the 1560s. There is evidence starting with Queen Elizabeth and John Hawkins of the British being involved in the trafficking in enslaved Africans. So what I want you to see here is the overall nature of this experience of this trafficking in enslaved Africans, the regions that were involved, and to give you a larger sense of what happened at the time. So it would have started, if you look at the screen there where my cursor is, the Northwest, starting with what they termed the Senegambia, all the way through to West Central Africa, a coastal region of over 5,000 miles. You will also notice the percentages. And so you'll see that, for example, that in the Senegambia region, only 6% of the 12.5 million Africans, estimated Africans that were that came to the Americas came from the Senegambia region. And I'm going to explain to you the supply side factors, events happening in Africa that will shape the distribution, that explain why some regions have higher percentages relative to others. So Senegambia has 6%, but if you go through, you'll see West Central Africa with 45.5 or almost 46%. It's also important that you note that Southeast Africa had a much, 4.3% in this context. That is vitally important. Now, overall, by 1800, I'll just speak to Jamaica in particular, there is a significant change in the number of Africans coming to Jamaica from West Africa broadly, but in particular from the Bight of Benin, and so Biafra, sorry. So what you'll see is that by 1776 through to 1807, more women are coming from the Bight of Biafra, and the Bight of Biafra is northeast Nigeria into Cameroon. So you begin to see a notice of a shift at that point with women. When you look at the trade also, it's important to have an understanding of who were involved. The trade was predominantly or dominated more so by men, 70% or more. There are also women and children. And the reason why I'm providing you with this quotation from Oluwado Equiano is to show the experience of what it was like even for a child. I mean, Equiano was 12 or 13 when he was kidnapped. He was out with his sister, and he talks about the trauma of being separated, of being kidnapped from his parents or wherever he was at that time. And he said, for my sister and I were then separated, you know, trying to comfort each other. She was torn from me, and he talks about it. And if you read Equiano's narrative, you start to get a sense of the brutality of the trafficking in enslaved Africans. Equiano also points to the length of time, and why this is important is because when we think of the trafficking, we always think, okay, enslaved people were only trafficked from the coastal regions. But here Equiano tells you that it took him 6 to 7 months to get from the interior to the coastal region. And we know that the Middle Passage lasted upwards of 2 months. So if you had that, you were talking 9 to 10 months, even a year, between being captured to arriving on the plantation at that point in time. So what I do here is if we were to superimpose the first map, looking at the various regions and the percentages, onto a modern map of Africa. When we say, therefore, Senegambia, we're talking from Senegal, Guinea-Bissau, Sierra Leone, all the way through. And you see West Central Africa is from Gabon, the Republic of Congo, the Democratic Republic of Congo, all the way through to Angola. The Southeast is interesting. You see the Southeast is from Mozambique all the way to Kenya, but interestingly also is Madagascar. And what that tells you, when you begin to look, therefore, at the journey, at the trafficking even from the Southeast to the Americas, the extent of it, the length of time it would have taken to get from that region to the Caribbean. This was just a slide for looking at the African origins of Jamaicans. I could do one for the larger Caribbean at a later point. You'll see, therefore, that for Jamaica in particular, 11,000 enslaved people came from Madagascar to Jamaica. You'll notice a very small number coming from the Senegambia region to the northwest. And therefore, the majority would have come from what is today Ghana, Togo, Nigeria, Cameroon, and 200 and something thousand from West Africa. When we talk about the trade in enslaved Africans or the trafficking in Africans, it's important to get a sense not only of the regions where they're coming from, but most of the countries that were involved and where the enslaved people ended up in the Americas. So what this table shows you quickly are the countries, the 6 or so countries that were involved, the majority countries, there are far more, but I'll explain that in a minute, that were involved, and the regions where the majority of enslaved ended up. So of the 12.5 million, if you look to the bottom right-hand corner, if you follow my cursor, you'll realize that 5.5 of the 12.5 million Africans who arrived in the Americas ended up in Brazil. 2.7 million ended up in the British Caribbean. And the numbers as to where enslaved people ended up was determined more or less by the size of the plantation system. So in effect, Brazil would have had the largest plantation system in the Americas, followed by the British Caribbean, followed by the French Caribbean. And you see that and you begin to see the numbers. What it also shows is that the jurisdictions or the countries that were trading. So for example, you'll see where Britain, of the 3 million that the British shipped, 2.6 million went to the British Caribbean. It's the same with Brazil and Portugal. If you were to look at Portugal, of the 5.8 million that they trafficked, 5.4 went to Brazil. And the same for France and Haiti, and the same for Spain and the Spanish Caribbean. So overall, these countries, what we call the major players, accounted for 98% of enslaved Africans that were trafficked between Africa and the Americas. And it's important to get that perspective as well. Now, there were other countries involved, other city-states that were involved, besides the usual suspects, the British, the Portuguese, the French, and so forth, right? And so in looking at the distribution, in particular, the database hosted by Emory, Slave Voyages database, you're able to identify these city-states. So Bremen, Denmark, city-states and countries, the Duchy of Courland, which is modern-day Latvia, Genoa, Hans Towns, Brandenburg, what is called the Hanseatic League, which stretches from Belgium all the way through to Poland in the Baltic area, Norway, Sardinia, these countries are involved. In looking at the structure, it's also crucially important that you get a sense not only of the distribution, who went where, which is important, but it's also important to get a sense of who were involved. Now, I mentioned Equiano before, and this is one of the dehumanizing aspects of the trade, because we're unable to identify the names of the millions of enslaved people trafficked during this period. But what historians have done is, starting when the trade was abolished in 1808, those slavers, vessels that were caught still trafficking the enslaved people, or those at that time, they were taken to Sierra Leone. Now, from that, they were able to get their names, their sex, their age, their origin, you can see ethnicity and so forth from that. Now, you can see there, Ekosumi, she was only 2 years old. So imagine the thousands, the hundreds of thousands of Ekisumis who were trafficked during that point, or even carrying trafficked during the period of the trade. She was the youngest identified. The oldest identified was Unkuri Dam. He was 77. And a couple of years ago, when I gave this lecture, on this topic, 77 years old at the time was, and I said it to the audience then, that's my grandmother's age. And imagine someone as frail as my grandmother being trafficked, being, brutally ripped apart and trafficked to the Americas during this point. And so you get a sense, therefore, and this kind of give you and try to humanize the trade and the trafficking at that point. Now, the experiences of enslaved people is critical. 64 days or more, 2 months or more, I mentioned, was the nature of the Middle Passage. Coming from the Southeast, coming from Madagascar would have taken much longer, inordinately longer time as well. What it therefore meant was the trafficking in enslaved people, the mortality, the number of Africans who died was mind-boggling. And again, points to the brutality of the trade or the trafficking in enslaved people. So just looking at the numbers specific to the Caribbean, and the Caribbean have added and have merged British, French, Spanish, Dutch, and so forth. 5.9 million of the 12.5 million ended up in the Caribbean. Of that number, if you go to the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5th column, you will see that close to 1 million, almost 1 million Africans died just trying to get to the Caribbean or being trafficked to the Caribbean. And the mortality rate was extremely high. It was much higher coming to the Caribbean than other regions quickly. So I'm going to just wrap up in a few minutes. Mortality is important to understand. This is the experience. This was how enslaved people were, I hate to use the term packaged, trafficked. You will see let me just say this, the fecal to oral transmission and how bacteria, pathogens, whatever you want to call it, diseases was so easy to be transferred during this point in time. All right. Enslaved women, their experiences were extremely awful. Sometimes we tend to forget that. And Alexander Falconbridge, who was a doctor, talked about it and talked about the the sexual exploitation and the abuse of enslaved women. Even though he says consent can be procured, it's important to note that there's no form of consent here. Enslaved women during this point, during this period, cannot give their consent, and we have to call it what it is. But nonetheless, that is an important thing to note in terms of the experiences of enslaved women. Finally, let me end here. It's important also to identify and to be aware that enslaved people were the first abolitionists. They were opposing their enslavement long before Wilberforce. And the idea is sometimes given of enslaved people and their, of Africans and their participation in the trade. Here's a quotation from Kader Kane from the northeastern region of Senegal. And he says, "We are warning you that all of those who will come to our land to trade in slaves will be killed. They resisted, and there is evidence of resistance, continuous resistance, all the way through." And why that is important, why the resistance is crucial, because it is a resistance that will shape the numbers. So the reason why Senegal, for example, or the Senegambia region, Senegal, Sierra Leone, and the Windward Coast, why the numbers are much smaller there relative to the others, is what the ship captains were saying, what they were saying. They were pointing to resistance. The Wolofs, for example, in Senegal, were resisting fiercely. Now, that is not to say that in West Central Africa there was not resistance. There was. But the resistance was so much higher in the Northwest. And that explains why in the overall aspect of the trafficking, you see the fact that in the Northwest, the numbers were much, much lower there relative to others. And the accounts from ship captains support this, support what we are finding from looking at this. So that is important to note. And that is, crucial as well. I know I said I would wrap up, but let me close here. In 1807, March 25th, Britain passed legislation. It was agreed in the House of Commons, in the Parliament, that the trade would end come, the beginning of January, at the end of the year, the beginning of January. Well, what you see between January 1st into, as far as October of 1808, and even beyond, as Prof. Shepherd said earlier, 1811, and there is even evidence of the trade in 1822, is what we call freedom delayed. So during this period, up to February of 1808, 4,000 Africans were trafficked to Jamaica. Overall for the Caribbean, 8,000 Africans were trafficked to the region. So what I've shown in this are the different countries: Jamaica, Barbados, Grenada, St. Vincent, other British Caribbean territories, or British colonized Caribbean territories, coming to the region. So you will see that there was freedom delayed. The notion that the trade ended in 1807 is wrong. The trade continued all the way through into 1808, and there is evidence of Africans being trafficked in 1811 and even beyond in 1822. So I'll close here, and I'll be open to questions, and I can further explain some of the other points that I have. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Reed, for that stark reminder of the horrid nature of the trafficking in enslaved Africans that led to plantation slavery. And your presentation goes so well with Dr. Turner's, because you have shown what happened, from where our ancestors were taken, what happened to them. And Dr. Turner has shown what happened to them when they were taken to the Caribbean and what slavery was like for enslaved women. So I think they went really well together, and I thank both of you. But I think both of you have also cemented in our minds, I think, why it is that today we must remember our ancestors based on what they endured. And I think finally why it is that the struggle for reparation is intensifying and has become a global movement. I don't think we can listen to these narratives and not say somebody ought to pay. Engage in a reparatory justice conversation for what you just revealed. And you know, I was listening, I don't know if any of you listened to the statement from the Secretary General of the United Nations for this day. But in that statement, I heard nothing about responsibility for why it is that we have a day like today. Why is it necessary for us to be called to remember today? There was no call on the perpetrators, the complicit states, to do anything. And I think we have to ask a question about that. So the floor is now open for questions. And I want to start with one to you, Dr. Turner, because if as Ahmed has shown, men dominated the numbers trafficked, why is it that the burden of production, the burden of field labor fell so disproportionately on women? If you could start with that while the students ask their questions or get the courage to put their questions forward.
So when we look at plantation colonies like Jamaica, which were primarily sugar producers, there is a very complicated division of labor system. And in this division of labor, you have a system where the strongest laborers were placed in the most demanding jobs, which were in the field. So there were, 3 gangs that were assigned to field labor, the first, the second, and the third gang. And you have women essentially dominating that first gang because you had men who were placed across a variety of plantation labor roles. So the plantation labor structure was a complicated system in which there were many different kinds of jobs in which an enslaved person could find themselves. So you had, for example, enslaved men who would have worked as skilled laborers. So the carpenters, the masons, the smiths, the boilers, all those who are involved in the industrial dimension of sugar production were spread across those skilled labor. And so you had women essentially bearing the brunt of field labor. When you look at the second and third gang, you're also seeing women dominating as well, largely because in these gangs, you had more supplemental laborers or laborers who were not as strong to physically endure the work demands of the first gang. The third gang, for example, included a lot of younger enslaved people, a lot of children. And so women who, given the gendered outlook of the plantation, were viewed as the natural caretakers of these children. And so what the plantation operated on was a gendered system in which ideas about the kinds of work that men and women were best suited for operated in varying degrees. So to be clear, while you have a complicated labor system where the most skilled labor, such as carpentry, masonry, were reserved for men, because again, the idea is that, men are naturally suited for these skilled labor. When you look at the field, you have the assignment of labor roles, particularly the first gang, on the basis of strength. And so the enslaved women who were sort of left over from that division between the skilled and I'm going to put in quotes, unskilled labor, because field labor required skill as well.
Absolutely.
But you know, within the plantation records, they're making this distinction between skilled and unskilled labor. So I'm just sort of using that framework to explain what I mean when I say field labor as being unskilled. But we do know that field labor is skilled. So the bulk of the population that was left over after that division between so-called skilled and unskilled labor, the women sort of took on the bulk responsibility in the field, particularly in the first gang, where, you know, you had strong women working, and then in gangs like the third gang, where another kind of gender division of labor operated, where women were being placed in charge of enslaved children or weaker workers. So Dr. Reed mentions the 77-year-old African who was trafficked. You would have had those workers placed in the third gang because the assessment is made on their failing or their decline in strength and health.
Thank you so much. If I could push that a little bit, when you look at the plantation lists and the division of labor by gender, because I say gender because I don't think it was sex, because I think there's a gendered and racial division of labor going on. When you look at some of these lists, as I was saying, I noticed that the artisans you mentioned, like the coopers, the carpenters, the blacksmiths, many of them tend to be mixed race. They are called Sambo or mulatto or quintroon or quadroon. Can you explain why this pattern developed?
So in the traditional or the sort of older historiography, we're seeing this language of the ranking game that talks about the ranking of enslaved people based on a number of criteria. So gender obviously was one category of ranking, making differences not just between men and women, but differences on the basis of age, on the basis of presumption of color, which is to what extent did this enslaved individual, you know, had a parent who was white and a parent who was Black. And so in some of the plantation records, you're seeing some amount of preference being given to so-called mixed race children, the Sambos, the mulattoes, as you mentioned, Prof, to have those more elite occupational roles. But this was not always consistently the case. What I've sort of seen in some of the records is that the assessment was based on the level of skill of the individual. So even though by and large, the initial preference is given to not just people of mixed race, people who had an African and a European ancestor, but people who were also born in the colonies over and above Africans. Over time, in some of those cases, these privileged workers, as they were called, were demoted or placed in other positions because the plantations were practical engines of production. And so even if an enslaved person had a white parent, if they were not performing the kind of labor that was demanded of them. So imagine, you know, an entire sugar harvest being spoiled because a boiler didn't know what he was supposed to do when he was supposed to start reducing the heat, for example, in sugar production. He would have cost the plantation an entire sugar harvest. And so even though when you look at these records, there is some amount of preferencing for either people of African descent who were born in the colonies or people of African descent who had European ancestry, the demands, the productive and profitable demands of plantation actually required that these individuals had skills and were able to perform the kind of labor demanded of them. So there's some amount of variation in that.
There's some suggestion also that what you call demotion or sending from house to field was not just economic, but it was punishment for not behaving, I suppose, in a way that they thought mixed race people should behave. I don't know what those expectations were, but I have seen some suggestion that was not just economic, but punishment as well. And we see the same thing for women as men. We see that the women who were mixed race were looking about babies. They were in the Bush's house, but I'm sure they also worked on the plantation because there are just so many domestic roles that you could have. So they would be also in the field. But I noticed on a particular list that whereas mulatto so-and-so and quadroon so-and-so were in the supervisory positions or were artisans or were in the house, Ibo Dick and Cameroon, I think it wasn't Cameroon, it was Coromanti Thomas, something like that. They were in the field, you know? So the difference was stark. But I'm asking if punishment came into it as well.
Yes.
But punishment as well. Privilege
Yes.
and punishment. Mhm.
Yes, yes. So absolutely, punishment was also a factor. From the perspective of enslavers, they believed that to work in the house was a privilege, that the enslaved person would have, been able to have shelter within the house of the master, would be able to eat from the master's table. But to be clear and to be sure, you're eating the scraps, you're eating the bone of the fish that is left over. You're sleeping on the floor, or, you're being raped, you're being called upon at any hour of the night to perform labor. So this perception of privilege from working within the house was more so a projected perception from the perspective of the enslaver. And so operating from that perspective, they thought that they were punishing an enslaved person, an errant enslaved person, by demoting them to the field.
Yeah.
But when you actually look at the kinds of cultures that emerge from being part of the community of enslaved people, you can make a different argument that it was actually perhaps more of a privilege to be part of the field gang, because you have a community that you were able to rely on versus being in the house where you were largely isolated from the community.
Okay.
So there is that sort of privileging and punishment, but the perception of what constitutes privilege was a very subjective one that differed from the perspective of the enslaved and the enslaver.
And I always question the use of privilege anyway, because slavery is slavery, wherever you have to be enslaved. So it's brutal and it's horrid all around. So I think you are correct to say it's the enslaver that's pushing this. But even today, I don't think any domestic worker will tell you it's a privilege to be in a house working, So it's a myth. I want to ask the students, please. Mr. Bousquet made an impassioned plea at the beginning of our lecture that you should ask the questions. You have two historians here, experts in their field. This topic, all these topics are on your syllabus. You're expected to have to integrate gender into your analyses of resistance, of the trafficking, of enslavement, plantation labor. This is an opportunity for you to speak to your sources, speak to your authors, and have your questions clarified. Well, let me ask Dr. Reed something now while students are getting their courage up to, and please post your questions in the chat. I know we're on Facebook and we're on YouTube, so please make every effort to ask your questions. But Dr. Reed, you used 12.5 million for the total numbers trafficked to the Caribbean. Well, it's not just to is that to the Americas or to the Caribbean? To the Americas, right? But it seems low to me. Can you explain how we arrive at 12.5?
Yes. So since it was, I think, Philip Curtin in 1969
yes,
published his numbers.
Historians, and he said about 9.
Yes, he said it was 9. Historians have been, questioning the methodology used, trying to get a sense of the true estimates. The true estimates, I don't think we'll ever know. What we have right now is 30 to 40 years of historians who have looked at the trade, who have looked at various aspects of it from the perspective of the French, the Spanish, the British, and so forth. They have, over the years, pooled their resources, and they started, I think it was in 1999, what they call the Transatlantic Slave Trade Database. It has since been updated. Now, what they have done now, it's been hosted by Emory University. They have identified 36,000 voyages from 1514 through I think the 1860s or thereabouts, somewhere along those lines. So the 12.5 million that I use comes from that database that is hosted by Emory University. That is a 12.5 million that voyages or missions, if you want to call it that they can identify where there are records as well. Now, also, this is important for you to know, and for the students to know, that there are historians who still do not agree with that. For example, Joseph Inikuri revised those estimates upwards. He says it's 15.4 million. Now, when we're looking at the trade, and you say this, you have this explained beautifully in the book you mentioned at the beginning, Trade in Souls, that if you look at the experience of enslaved people, there are 6 critical stages. So if you were to look at those 6 critical stages, the numbers would be significantly higher, because when Equiano talks about the journey to the coast, if we could ever get a hold of those numbers, then we would see upwards of maybe 30, 40 million. So we will never know the true numbers of enslaved people. We do not know the numbers of people who died while being in those barracoons on the coast. We have no estimates of that. But what we know is 12.5 million were trafficked. Of that 12.5 million, over 2 million died. And the other aspects of the trade, we will never know. But again, it's important. Historians are not there's no agreement across the discipline as to the true numbers. Inikuri has given a different methodology and a different estimate. His estimates are much higher, 15.4. Then you have the ELTIS database, which is what I'm speaking from, which is what,
and
the usefulness of it.
Others have said 200 million.
Yes, and UNESCO, I think, uses 30 million.
Okay,
so
yes.
there are.
So what you can say is that based on the documents that this group of historians and cliometricians and other experts used to track 36,000 voyages, this is the figure for this.
Is the figure that, yes.
But of course, we know that there was people who destroyed records, people who did not want others to know that they were what they were doing, and clandestinely and did the trafficking without any documentation.
Yes.
Students, you need to know, we will never know the numbers, but this is an indicative number. But what about the mortality rate? Again, people are saying what is published is low. I mean, 10% or less, that's really low.
So if you were to yes, well, it's 14%. 14%,
okay.
14%
on average.
In some instances, for Jamaica in particular, the British Caribbean, it was much higher, it was 16. But if you were to decompose or to disaggregate or to break the trafficking voyage by voyage, then there are some voyages where you will see mortality rates of 50% or more. For example, with the Zong, which you have talked about quite a lot on your program, the mortality rate on the Zong was 53 or 54%. That is 440 enslaved Africans being trafficked, 200 and something dying, of which I think it was 133 who were thrown overboard alive at that point in time. You have the Saint Michel, where the mortality rate was 96%. So if you decompose it, if you break it down and start to track individual voyages, then the true horror of the trafficking in Africans comes to light. But overall, yes, they have arrived at 16%. And again, it's based on the numbers. And of course, as with all things, we know, numbers can be switched, numbers can be fixed as it goes along. And you're correct, and I'll use the term carefully, the illegal trade in quotation.
Everything was illegal, so I know what you mean.
Yes, I'll use it carefully.
Yes.
So there was that going on as well, in which those numbers will never be captured. We'll never know the true estimates there for the quote unquote the illegal trade. Yes.
So I have another question for you, another question for Sasha. But again, I'm asking the production assistants who are on this to put in the chat any questions that the students have, or the teachers, or those who are on the various platforms. I can't believe the students don't have questions. I'm not seeing any, they're just listening, I suppose, and taking notes. But Sasha, in your book, Contested Bodies, you give the impression that once 1807 happened for the British, because remember, the students are studying other jurisdictions too. And we know that Denmark didn't abolish slavery or the trafficking at that time. Portugal didn't abolish slavery until 1888. The Spanish, in terms of Cuba, that was 1886. I think the Dutch, 1848, and so on. So we know that there are different dates for different people. What we know is that Britain was not the first country either to abolish the trafficking or to abolish slavery. I keep hearing that all the time. So students, do not believe that myth. Haiti was the first to end both the trafficking and, in other words, Haiti forced France to stop sending people to their country and forced France and its allies from imposing slavery on them after 1804. So let's be clear. And even if we're talking about Europeans, Denmark abolished before Britain. So let's be clear. But it doesn't matter. The whole thing should have ended earlier. But Sasha, in your book, you say that after the trafficking was officially ended, through legislation, women's bodies became the site of power contestation almost, that women, the focus was on reproduction. Can you, in a minute, say something about that?
Sure. So 1807 is sort of a later date. In the earlier sections of the book, I go back to as early as the 1780s. And the reason I go back to 1780s, so before I explain the women's bodies section, I want to just sort of clarify the date, just as you did, Prof. Shepherd. The reason I start in the book earlier in 1780s is because the shift towards reproduction and the criticism of the slave trade or the trade in enslaved Africans came about because of abolitionist activism. So the British became interested in ending the trade because of abolitionist activism. And this began in earnest in the 1780s. And so the shift that we're seeing towards reproduction came about largely because the abolitionists, who the British are celebrating as saints, were not so saintly, because what they were proposing was that instead of relying on the transatlantic trade in Africans, which brought a whole series of problems, including rebellion, and also this is in the context of the Haitian Revolution, where the argument was that people born on the continent were more rebellious than those raised in the colonies. The abolitionists proposed an elaborate system in which the reproduction of slavery or the reproduction of enslaved people should replace the trafficking in enslaved Africans. And there were several economic and social as well as moral reasons that they gave for this. So between the 1780s, when you're seeing the emergence of figures like James Ramsey and William Wilberforce, down to 1807, when the decision was finally taken by the British Parliament to end their involvement in the transatlantic trade in Africans, you had a series of proposals made by these abolitionists on just how to achieve natural reproduction, the reproduction of enslaved people in the colonies, as opposed to relying on the transatlantic trade in enslaved people. And so the argument about women's bodies as a site of power comes about because what then happens in this period of abolitionist activism is that enslavers in the Caribbean had to then revise how they were managing women's labor on the ground, how they responded to women as mothers, how they responded to even children. And so enslaved women who before this period in the 1780s had already carved out a kind of precarious autonomy over childcare and motherhood were now forced into a different position because the political landscape in which slavery was operating was now changing. So you had women now sort of bringing to enslavers the questions, or bringing them to task, better put, their attempts to now control their bodies to ensure that they reproduce the population in the Caribbean locally, because now the rumor by the 1780s and definitely by 1807 was that the trafficking would come to an end.
Okay. All right. So we're coming to the end. I wanted the production assistants to show on the screen 2 books that will help the students to have an idea of this topic. One is Engendering History. The other one is Women in Caribbean History. So hopefully they'll put up the details in the chat and show the books so that students can get an idea. But okay, there we are. So Women in Caribbean History, which I did for the CXC students actually. And the other one, so this is more CSEC. The other one is for more advanced students, Engendering History, Caribbean Women in Historical Perspectives. If we could have that one now, please. Do we have that? Oh, this is the updated one. Okay, that's fine. Engendering Caribbean History, Cross-Cultural Perspectives. Great. So both levels can actually use those texts. So I'm going to give you 3 minutes each to just have some closing remarks, and then I'll call on Mr. Bousquet to give the vote of thanks. But let me, because I don't think the students feel confident to ask their questions, but they're learning so much, I think. So Ahmed, in your closing remarks, I want you to at least say something for the students, clarify something. So you talked about how ships were being seized, taken to Sierra Leone, taken to court, and I think in some cases sent back to I don't know if you could say where they were sent. So 3 things I want to say. Where did the enslaved Africans end up? Those who were released from these slaving voyages from other countries. That's 1. 2, was it economic or humanitarian reasons why Britain abolished the trafficking and why they were seizing or patrolling the seas to seize and say seize and desist, I suppose? And finally, Ahmed, students ask off air, but not on air, who conceptualized, capitalized, and legalized the trafficking in enslaved Africans? And for Sasha, I suppose you talked about abolitionists, and you talked about those on the ground who were resisting. Can you say something about how you see the wars of resistance in terms of ending the trafficking? What role would you give resistance? And would you agree that we should call Sally Bassett, Queen Nana of the Maroons, Bussa, Sharp, and so on, abolitionists also? So let me give Sasha the floor, and then Ahmed, you, and then Earl Bousquet.
So the term abolitionist, I have a very difficult relationship with that term, largely because of its being intertwined with the work of the British. There are other words that I often prefer when I think about the works of the enslaved people towards the Emancipation Project. We think of them as resistors, we think of them as rebels, we think of them as freedom fighters, because from my perspective, what abolitionist was this very convoluted and complicated attempt to salvage and actually protect British economic interests. And so thinking historically about how this idea of abolitionism from above has evolved, it too often gives credit to the British and their so-called humanitarian campaign. Even so, even within that framing, we still have to be attentive to the works of enslaved people, of freed Blacks in England, who still fit within that framework. So Dr. Reed mentions Equiano. There are many others, the Somerset case, for example, individuals in England, Mary Prince, who were part of the official quest in England to end the slave trade and to end slavery. So you can still point to enslaved people who fit, or freed Blacks who fit within that frame. But in terms of on the ground, I think there are more accurate terminologies that would speak to the kinds of political activities in which enslaved people were engaged, not just on the plantation, but from the very moment of captivity.
Absolutely.
And so abolition has a way of speaking only to the trade and the kind of legal work around ending the trade, but doesn't always speak to the larger fight, which is a fight for freedom, a fight for liberty and equality. So I would sort of change around the framing a bit when I'm talking about the enslaved and free Blacks.
So freedom fighters, I think we could take away that.
Yes.
To say freedom fighters. And since Britain and those in Britain have sort of monopolized the term abolitionists, we use freedom fighters, but also to, as you say, understand that even within the UK and in Europe generally, in France, in all of the states that were complicit, there were people fighting and lobbying in various ways for emancipation and for true freedom. And I'm glad you mentioned that from the moment of capture, there was resistance. And I think Ahmed mentioned earlier that the resistance was right across Africa as well. People often seem to think that there was no resistance within Africa, and that's not true. Okay, Ahmed, you have the last word. Well, before Earl.
Yes, thank you. So just quickly, going back to the questions on this. So there were over 2,000. So after 1888, the Royal Navy seized, intercepted, whatever you want to call it, over 2,000 vessels, totaling, there were 91,000 or 92,000 Africans. They were taken to Sierra Leone. They went to court. Many of them ended up staying there as well. On the larger question of whether it was economic or
before you go on to that though, weren't some relocated to the Caribbean. It depends on where they were caught. If they were caught nearer to the region.
Yes, it's true, but I can't remember the exact number as to how many ended up in the Caribbean.
Because they would have been
and
called
where-
liberated Africans.
Yeah, and we're in the Caribbean. I know Barbados. I could go back and check.
Yes, some ended up in Jamaica as well.
So yes, a good number ended up in
Quote
Barbados.
unquote liberated, because of course they were made to work in various areas.
Right, during that point, yeah.
Okay, so your second.
So on the
question.
issue of whether it was economic or humanitarian, I'll start with the post 1807 effort to sanitize the history. You'll see the narrative after 1807, the role of humanitarians and what role they played, and that stayed there in the historiography, was dominant in the historiography of the writing of history until the 1930s, when Eric Williams from Trinidad, who later became Prime Minister of Trinidad and Tobago, submitted his PhD thesis. In 1944, coming out of that thesis, Eric Williams published Capitalism and Slavery. And in Capitalism and Slavery, in the very preface, Williams said this unapologetically, that slavery was an economic institution. It was founded on economics, and economics influenced the disbandment or the outlawing of it. In particular, what he argues is that come 1776, around the time of the American Revolution, the plantation system throughout the British colonized West Indies started to decline. And what he's driving at is the old mercantilist arrangement that was disrupted by that revolution. In other words, Caribbean planters no longer had access to the mainland market. They had no access to supplies from the mainland market. And so what Williams showed is that from 1776 onward, the pre-revolution era of profitability that the plantation system enjoyed was no longer there. And so from that period, 1776 onward, it was a period of what he called uninterrupted decline. And when you read the plantation papers, correspondence between attorneys and owners in Europe, there is evidence supporting Williams on that. So it's that movement coinciding with the rise of industrialization and the move to a more capitalist framework that Williams put as the explanation for the outlawing of the trade. There is also the need to.
So when Britain is seizing and relocating or freeing, is that because they truly want to enforce their Abolition Act? Or is that because the competition, because other countries were not outlawing the trafficking yet? Is that a way to ensure that those countries don't have the advantage over Britain economically?
Economically, right. But I was also going to add to the argument around resistance. Claudius Fergus published a book a couple of years ago in which he talked, and of course you have publications by Beckles and Robin Blackburn talking about the role that resistance played in all of this, and in particular what happened in Haiti. Haiti was in the memory, and it stayed there for most planters during this period. There was constant reference to what happened in Haiti, not wanted a similar experience to what happened in Haiti. And Eric Williams always says this, and I've always used this quotation from William: if it's not emancipation from above, it will be from below. And so what you see, therefore, moving throughout the period is the plantation economy never ever recovered from what happened after 1776. And that uninterrupted decline continued all the way through to emancipation. You'll see, if you were to look at the curve, it goes that way. And it continues all the way through to the 28th century. And so in most Caribbean countries by 1900, sugar was not the dominant crop being produced, or not as much sugar. And there were not as many plantations by that point in time, by 1900. So the Williams argument holds through even way beyond abolition, way beyond emancipation. And there were, you know, you'll see the economy going through these shocks caused again by, for example, the Sugar Duties Act of 1846. So the economic argument is extremely strong on this, and Williams is powerful in his articulation of this as to what happened and how economic motives influence Britain's decision.
We're running out of time, but if you could just address the last one quickly so I could go to Mr. Mustafa.
The conceptualization and legalization of it. From as early as, I said this earlier, the mid to late 16th century, we begin to see Queen Elizabeth, or Elizabeth I, along with John Harkins, sending missions, and she actually invested in these missions to traffic enslaved Africans. And so from that point in time, what you begin to see is the British in particular, and I'll stay with the British on this one, creating and putting forward charters, creating these companies like the Company of Royal Adventurers Trading in Africa, the Royal African Company, the South Sea Company. They use this to legalize it. They conceptualize it, of course. And most importantly, what students need to walk away with is that they profited tremendously from their involvement in the trade and trafficking in enslaved people. So what happens over time, and I'll close here, is by the 17th century, towards the end, by around 1680, when the Royal African Company was doing so well, making so much money, you had the British public saying to the Royal African Company, by extension, the royal family, that you need to end this monopoly. We need to share this trade and to be part of this venture. So what you see then is not only the conceptualization of the trade from the beginning and the legalization of it in how they operated, but the profits that they generated during that point. And therefore, from that point onward, you begin to see, as we get to the 18th century, the explosion, the rise in the numbers of Africans trafficked. But of course, for us, looking back, slavery was never legal. And that's an important point for us to mention.
But at the same time, Dr. Reed, for those who are saying reparation cannot be paid because it's too long in the past and so on, and as you know, even today, Britain has not apologized. They haven't used apology. They have not engaged in a repatriate justice conversation. And based on the statements that you mentioned earlier and others, they're not taking responsibility because they say it's too long in the past and so on. But and they say it was legal at the time. No, if you abolish something by legislation, isn't that a kind of admission that you are involved in something in which you should not have been involved? You know, you pass legislation and say from this day forward, we're not going to do this. So that's implicit, I think, admission. But we can argue that another day, Abed. I don't think we have time. Two last have come in. Sorry, you wanted to say?
I was just going to say quickly that in international law, I mean, if you look at what we are showing the numbers, and there are many human rights instruments as well talking about this, is slavery was a crime against humanity.
Yeah, yeah.
Two, it was genocide. We can prove the genocidal concept of it as well. So to argue legality at that time is it's kind of fuzzy. It's fuzzy on that level.
Yes, and I think we could add that there's nothing in international law which says descendants can't claim on behalf of their ancestors, even though they are saying the direct victims are long dead.
Yes, but we can prove beneficiary, but that's for another argument.
Yes, okay. All right, Sasha, quickly, 2 comments have come in, and I think, sorry, Earl, I'm gonna get to you quick in a while. So someone has posted in the chat, we still today carry out the notion of the high color / mixed race is still better, beautiful, and given better opportunities. And it's not a question, it's just a comment. So I'm just saying that has come up. And then there's a question, we still have not completely cleared ourselves from those shackles. Well, I don't know if this is related to the earlier comment. So what do we do going forward to break this trend in our next generation? Maybe it's this legacy of colorism and hierarchy. Sasha, you want to take that quickly?
Sure. So absolutely, yes. Part of the remarks that I gave earlier is around the idea of decolonizing history, but the other piece that needs to come before or come as part of decolonizing history is the decolonization of our own minds, which is that colonialism was not simply a structure that attempted to extract material benefits or to exploit the bodies of enslaved people. It actively worked on the mind. And so what we've inherited as people, the descendants of a formerly colonized people, is a mindset wherein certain ideas and certain ideologies about Blackness, ideas even about Africa, continues to define and permeate within contemporary society. And so part of the project of decolonization that we do have to engage in as well is to explore the exploitative origins of some of those so-called privileges that were given to these various groups and the ways in which that actually acted as a way of perpetuating an exploitative system. So even when we use it today, we have to be conscious of its origins and conscious of how in using those kinds of rankings and privileging, we're actually extending the colonial project. Mm-hmm. We can't sort of do the work of decolonizing our mind without decolonizing history. And the way to do that, part of which is, the kind of work that we're doing here today, which is to go back to the source and to challenge the ways in which the histories have been written, the ways in which it has been written from the perspective previously of the colonizer, and the work that has been done. Dr. Reed sort of mentions the work of Eric Williams, who challenged a long-standing humanitarian thesis projected by the British to say, well, there are economic aspects or economic factors to be considered here. That work began through Williams, coming through with Professor Shepard and many others from the University of the West Indies to challenge the way history has been written. And so I think, the way we write and think about history within the Caribbean has to challenge a lot of those assumptions that have been made about peoples of the Caribbean and the nature of Caribbean history itself.
Yes, and I think the ranking has been unpacked by Lucille Matherin Meartoo, our pioneer woman historian, who actually set up the ranking for us, which we have to, we have to oppose that ranking. And I think it was, she said, under slavery, Black women labored, right? Colored women served, and white women consumed. And so we have to work to destabilize that ranking. even today. But for our young people, for the young person who asked this question, this generation and future generation can only work and to get rid of this kind of tendency in our society by one, studying history, and two, lobby for Caribbean history to be a mandatory subject in your school and also at all levels of the education system. If we don't know what happened, we can't know what to fix. If we and this is, it is continuing because we don't know history, and that's why it's continuing. So we have to make sure that we know, we have the information. Historians have certainly written the information, but if people are not reading and studying, then the cycle is not going to be broken. So thank you very much. So Mr. Bousquet, it's over to you now for your vote of thanks. I think we have just about 5 minutes to go.
And I promise it will not be that long, except just to make 2 points that I noted during the presentation by the two presenters with regard to the roles of women in medicine, the roles of Blacks and the contributions of Blacks to pioneering in medicine. I always remember the fact that the first surgical operation, as we know it today, was not invented by South African Dr. Christian Barnard, like we were taught, but actually by a Black man by the name of Hamilton Nabi, who was his gardener, who learned from practicing on animals, including dogs and cats. We also learned more recently that the vaccination, the first vaccination was introduced to the United States, again, by a Black, but those things are not necessarily taught and known. And my last point here in relation to the roles of women in the liberation struggles here, we have a very interesting story that has been researched and presented by Dr. June Soomer called Stiff-Backed Women, which looks at the role of groups of women between St. Lucia and Martinique following the passage of the Code Noir, where certain non-pure whites found themselves with equal designation as Blacks, and they therefore joined. And what you had was women, a group of women who used boats to move from island to island, including St. Lucia, Martinique, Barbados, and St. Vincent, executing terror wherever they went. But that story is hardly written, but it is, like I said, was presented in a number of papers by Dr. June Soomer in Brazil. Well, we get to our vote of thanks, and it is my duty and pleasure to thank Professors Dr. Sasha Turner and Ahmed Reed for their contributions that have certainly given us perspectives that we either didn't know of or hadn't been shared with us before. Thank you for your perspectives. We want to thank we didn't see or hear from them, but we want to thank Gabriel Hemmings and Michael Hilton of the committee established by the Center for Reparations Research in Jamaica. That is a committee, folks, that works 24/7 every day of the week to ensure that these lectures that only take place 2 hours a month do take place in the way that they have, like today. Thank you. We also want to say thank you to the UWI Open Campus EDU technical team. Again, we don't see them, but they're behind the screens. And today, with David Foster, Patrick Johnson, Richard Bath, we want to thank you. You're always with us, and your experience contributions have always helped make each of these sessions better than the previous. We want to thank the UWI Open Campus St. Lucia for its usual assistance, and we also want to thank the National Preparatory Committee stakeholders who are not only the member entities of the National Reparations Committee, but other stakeholding entities that have continued to assist us. And of course, we want to thank the CARICOM Reparations Commission for its support, its inspiration, particularly the leadership of the chair of the CARICOM Reparations Commission, Sir Hilary Beckles, whose leadership has taken us from the establishment in 2013 of the CRC to where we are today, hosting these important virtual lectures to Caribbean schools. And last but by no means least, thank you, Professor Shepherd, for your once again taking us through another very successful session. And like I promised, I will not be as long as I started. Thank you, and back to you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Bousquet, and thank your committee for always working with us to ensure that we bring you experts who not only help you with the syllabus students, but who help to provide the justification for why it is that there is a reparation movement galloping across the world, not just in the Caribbean. So all that is left for me to do now is to thank everyone for having joined this 6th lecture in the Collaborative Schools History Lecture Series. I invite you to look out for the details of the 7th lecture, which I believe is slated for April 22. If there's any change, we will let you know. I urge you to use the ideas that you learned today to destabilize the colonialist narrative, the colonialist history. When you apply the ideas that you learned today, you will be able to challenge those who are spinning myths about our history. And I urge you finally to use the information to join the reparation movement on behalf of your ancestors. And you must personalize this, because we're talking about your family, your ancestors, your forebears. It's not just a myth, it's not just some people out there. And when you think about it that way, I think you will have your reason for joining the movement. You're not too young to do this. And for those adults who joined or feed and who are not yet convinced or who are not yet in the movement, I say, I don't know what else you need to be convinced about what happened to our women and our men and why this movement is important. So thanks everyone. See you in April. And thank you to everyone